The great hall of St. James's Palace had not witnessed such a densely packed gathering of the realm's most powerful figures since the late Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Tonight was ostensibly a celebration of legacy, a state banquet honoring the newly solidified reign of King Charles III and his queen Camilla. The chandeliers, dripping with crystal tears, cast a honeyed glow over the assembled dukes, diplomats, and lords, all murmuring in that low, conspiratorial hum unique to British nobility. At the head of the table, Camilla, resplendent in a deep emerald gown and the Belgian sapphire tiara, appeared at ease. She had spent 2 decades navigating the storm of public opinion, and finally she sat at the apex. Or so she believed. The court had settled into its comfortable rhythm of deference, yet a palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air like the scent of beeswax from the ancient oak panels. Something was different tonight. The seating arrangement, orchestrated by the Lord Chamberlain's office, had been leaked to a select few insiders, and it suggested a tectonic shift no one dared speak aloud. When the grand doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a groan of iron hinges, the temperature of a room seemed to plummet and rise simultaneously. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, entered not as a guest, but as a force of nature. She was not walking in Camilla's shadow, she was cleaving through it. For weeks, royal correspondents had speculated that Catherine might miss the event due to her ongoing preventative chemotherapy treatments, a brave battle she had publicly alluded to earlier in the year. The official line from Kensington Palace was that her attendance was to be determined. That ambiguity was a deliberate tactical fog. As she glided past the yeomen of the guard, every head turned, not out of politeness, but out of a primal instinct to witness a predator enter the arena. Camilla's hand, resting on her champagne flute, froze mid-air. The Queen's smile did not falter, but her eyes, narrowed and sharp as a serpent's, registered the blow. The weapon Catherine wielded was not a word, but a stone. Resting upon her chestnut waves was the crown of Queen Alexandra. It was not a tiara, it was a crown, technically one of the most potent and seldom-seen artifacts in the royal collection. Forged in 1902 for Edward VI's consort, it had not been worn by a Princess of Wales in living memory. It was heavier, grander, and more politically charged than the Belgian sapphire resting on Camilla's brow. In the esoteric language of the court, jewelry is never merely decorative. The lover's knot, which Catherine often wears, speaks of romance and Diana's ghost. But the crown of Alexandra speaks of power, conquest, and the direct lineage of sovereigns. By choosing this particular piece, Catherine was not making a fashion statement, she was issuing a declaration of regency. A retired courtier, watching from a gallery, whispered to a neighbor, "She has just outranked the Queen," not by title, but by the weight of history. Camilla saw it instantly. The ancient sapphires on her own head suddenly felt like costume jewels. The king's reaction was the first crack in the evening's facade. King Charles III, seated at the center of the high table, watched his daughter-in-law approach with an expression that defied easy reading. There was no anger, but there was a profound, existential sadness mixed with a flicker of pride. Charles has always been a man torn between his love for Camilla, his darling wife, and his deep understanding of the monarchy's machinery. He knows that a crown is a contract with the people, not a right of blood alone. As Catherine curtsied to him, a perfect, deep anatomical curtsy that acknowledged his sovereignty while simultaneously displaying her own regal bearing, he extended his hand and kissed hers. It was a gesture rarely given to a subordinate. He treated her, in that fleeting moment, as an equal monarch. Camilla, seated to his left, watched this intimacy and felt the cold draft of obsolescence. Her knuckles whitened against her chair. The court held its breath. This was not a family dinner. This was a succession battle fought with etiquette. As the first course, a delicate consommé, was served, the true dismantling of Camilla's evening began. It was not overt. There was no shouting, no theatrical interruption. It was 1,000 tiny cuts of protocol. The Lord Steward, a man who had reportedly been loyal to Camilla's household, made a catastrophic error. He offered Catherine the first toast of the evening, bypassing the Queen. Tradition dictates that the host, the monarch, or the highest-ranking female initiates the formal toasts. But as the servers cleared the soup, the steward raised his glass toward Catherine and said, "To the Princess of Wales, the future of our house." The room froze. For 3 seconds, silence reigned. Camilla's face drained of color, not pale, but a waxy, sickly yellow. She began to shake, almost imperceptibly at first, a tremor in her right hand that rattled the silver spoon against the porcelain. The king placed a steadying hand over hers, but the damage was done. The court had witnessed the flag pass. Catherine, with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, did not gloat. She simply inclined her head and took a sip of water, not wine, a subtle reminder of her health struggles and her moral high ground. It was during the main course, a roast Windsor pheasant, that the conversation turned to the most dangerous territory: legacy. Lady Susan Hussey, a veteran lady-in-waiting and a fierce protector of the late Queen Elizabeth's memory, leaned toward Catherine. Her voice, though intended to be private, carried in the acoustics of the stone hall. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Susan said, "your decision to accept the patronage of the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors last week was noted. My late mistress held that role for 60 years. She would have approved of your diligence. This was a nuclear strike in polite society. The Royal Corps of Naval Constructors is one of the most ancient and unfilled patronages. It had been held in abeyance since Elizabeth's death. Camilla had lobbied for 6 months to have it transferred to her name, viewing it as a weighty military affiliation that would cement her status. But the palace had quietly awarded it to Catherine without a press release. Camilla dropped her fork. The clang echoed like a church bell. She turned to the king, her eyes screaming a silent fury. But Charles was deep in conversation with a Saudi prince, pointedly ignoring the battlefield beside him. The tipping point came not from an adult, but from the periphery. Princess Beatrice, who rarely involves herself in the senior court dynamics, leaned forward and asked Catherine a question about the renovation of Adelaide Cottage. It was a benign query, but the answer revealed Catherine's strategic grip on the future. "We are keeping the nursery there for now," Catherine said softly, "but the children have asked for more space at Windsor. We are looking at the options for expanding the private apartments." The implication was staggering. The private apartments at Windsor Castle are the sovereign's private domain. By casually mentioning an expansion, Catherine was signaling that she and William were not merely guests at Windsor, but permanent fixtures who were reconfiguring the royal estate to suit their family. This is the language of a monarch in waiting. Camilla attempted to interject to steer the conversation toward her own charity work with osteoporosis, but the table ignored her. Once the magnet of the court, she had become a ghost at the feast. Her eyes glistened, not with tears of sentiment, but with the hot, dry sting of humiliation. As the dessert course arrived, a tower of profiteroles drizzled in Windsor honey. The psychological shift became complete. Catherine began to speak of her return to public duty in a way that sounded less like a recovery and more like a coronation. She detailed a 5-point plan for her Shaping Us campaign to be rolled out across the Commonwealth, a plan that directly overlapped with and superseded Camilla's own reading room literary initiative. "We find that literacy is only effective when emotional resilience is built first," Catherine explained to the Archbishop of Canterbury. "Otherwise, we are just teaching words without wisdom." The Archbishop nodded fervently. Camilla, whose literary festival is her pride and joy, looked as if she had been slapped. This was intellectual usurpation. Catherine was not just taking the crown visually. She was stealing the Queen's intellectual agenda, rebranding it as superior, and receiving the blessing of the Church while doing so. Outside, the rain began to lash against the mullioned windows, creating a fittingly dramatic soundtrack. It was then that the most shocking moment of the evening occurred. The king rose to deliver his annual State of the Family address, a short, informal speech usually filled with platitudes. But tonight, Charles looked directly at Catherine and deviated from the teleprompter. "We have seen," Charles said, his voice gravelly but clear, "that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it is the roar of a lion. But sometimes it is the quiet resilience of a woman who plants a garden while the world is burning. He paused, and every eye followed his gaze. The Princess of Wales has weathered a storm that would have broken mast and men. And she has returned to us not merely whole, but resolute. He raised his glass to the resilience of the future. He did not mention Camilla. He did not toast the Queen. In royal protocol, for the king to offer a specific toast to a junior royal without mentioning the consort is the equivalent of declaring a regency. Camilla rose abruptly. The scraping of her chair was a screech of agony. She excused herself. A migraine, she whispered to a footman, but the court knew the truth. As she walked the gauntlet of whispered conversations and pitying glances, her legs betrayed her. She was shaking visibly now, a full-body tremor that her chic gown could not hide. The infamous stiff upper lip had dissolved into a trembling mess. A footman rushed to steady her elbow, but she shook him off with a violence that shocked the diplomats. She glanced back over her shoulder, a final, baleful look at Catherine, who remained seated serene, her hands folded on the table. In that look was the death of an era. For 2 decades, Camilla had played the long game, waiting for the world to accept her. She had outlasted Diana's ghost, survived the paparazzi, and climbed the greasy pole of royal favor. But she had forgotten that the monarchy is a glacier, not a ladder. It moves slowly, but it crushes everything in its path. After Camilla retreated to the drawing-room turned sanctuary, the atmosphere in the hall shifted from tense to electric. The king did not follow her. Charles remained, telling a convoluted story about his watercolor paintings, his way of defusing the bomb he had just detonated. But the courtiers were no longer listening to the king. They were watching Catherine. The princess excused herself briefly, not to flee, but to speak to the kitchen staff. It was a masterstroke. While Camilla was upstairs clutching a cold compress, Catherine was in the kitchens, shaking hands with the sous chefs and thanking the scullery maids. By the time she returned to the ballroom for the evening's dancing, word had spread through the entire palace staff. The queen had fled, but the princess stayed to work. Loyalty in a royal household is a currency traded in these small moments. Within an hour, the betting odds on Camilla's public approval rating dropped by 15 points, while Catherine surged to an all-time high. The final tableau of the evening is the one that will hang in the National Portrait Gallery someday. As the guests lined up to bid farewell to the king, Camilla reappeared, her makeup refreshed but her eyes hollow. She stood beside Charles, her smile a rictus of duty. Then Catherine arrived in the receiving line, leading her daughter, Princess Charlotte. Here was the future queen, holding the hand of the future queen. Camilla leaned forward to kiss the air beside Catherine's cheek, a gesture of false peace. But Catherine turned her head at the last second, so that the kiss landed on the corner of her mouth, a gesture that in royal circles is a grim insult, suggesting the other person is forcing intimacy where none exists. Camilla recoiled as if bitten. Charlotte, all of 8 years old, curtsied to Camilla, then turned and gave a much deeper, lingering curtsy to her mother. A child's instinct had just articulated the pecking order that the adults were too afraid to name. As the Bentley whisked the king and queen back to Clarence House, the silence was suffocating. Camilla turned to Charles. "You toasted her," she whispered. "In front of the entire court, you toasted her and you left me to bleed." Charles, staring out the window at the wet London streets, replied with a weariness that transcended their marriage. "She is not just a princess, Camilla. She is the guarantee that we survive. You wanted the crown. You have it. But the crown, my dear, is a paper crown if the people do not bow. Tonight, you saw who they bow to." When the car stopped, Camilla exited so quickly she nearly tripped on the curb. The photographers captured it. The queen, legs unsteady, face a mask of shock, rushing into the palace as if fleeing a fire. The next morning, the tabloids ran a single headline, "The Shaking of the Queen," and underneath, a photo of Catherine, radiant, wearing Alexander's crown. The caption read, "The Princess of Wales takes command. No shots fired. Total victory." The monarchy had not changed hands in a day, but the balance of power had shifted forever. leaving one woman shaking in the cold English rain and another standing in the light.